good morning, good afternoon and good evening to all our friends viewing from around the world. This is the first in our series of a number of webinars tackling the key important themes of carbon and sustainability. And we're kicking off with some really excellent speakers that are going to unpack the world of smart and sustainable mobility as we look at how we are all placemakers and work together to really create great cities. We'll be looking at sustainable mobility and its global application across technological and behavioural aspects. We'll be looking at the human-centric approach to planning and implementing mobility services and the importance of putting the customer first. And that's all around understanding different needs and personas of the travelling public. We'll move to how this has worked out on the ground in the West Midlands through the exciting Live Labs project, and then look at the vital role of effective policy frameworks to deliver carbon reduction. We'll finish by looking at how the rail industry has responded to new mobility needs and the new greening of the rail sector. So, with no more ado, I will welcome our speakers today. We have Giles Perkins, who is the Head of Future Mobility at WSP. We have Deborah Fox, who is the Head of Demand Management at Transport for West Midlands in the UK, and is also looking after the CILT UK Travel Demand Management Forum. We also have Becky Liu from the University of Hong Kong. We're delighted to have her with us, and she leads a key transport studies unit there, as well as holding a number of other key positions. And finally, we're going to hear from Lucy Anderton. Now, Lucy will be on a video clip, as unfortunately she couldn't make it physically today, but she is the head of the sustainability unit at the International Union of Railways and on secondment there from Network Rail. My name's John Harris, as Jasper said. I look after the international education and business development side at the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, but also have a real passion around sustainability. And I am a director of a community rail partnership here in the UK that is really focused on sustainable transport and making sure that people, particularly in rural areas, have access to the transport networks they need. So you now have your panel in front of you. Let's kick off straight away by hearing from Giles, and he's going to kick off with this human-centric approach to the future of mobility. Thank you, Giles.
Thank you very much, John. My name is Giles Perkins. I'm the Head of Future Mobility for WSP here in the UK. WSP, a large international consultancy company, and I spend my time tackling many of those things that John's just described, but how transportation is changing. So this will be a very, very quick trot. Slides will be available afterwards. So start with a quote from Heraclitus, Greek philosopher: "The only thing that is constant is change." And this is really where we are at now in the transportation space, that everything is changing. But if we think about the future, what we're actually talking about is the things on this iceberg that are below the waterline: climate change, societal change, our different energy mix needs and how that's changing. The global trends that affect everything that we do, retail change, what we need from skills and education, whether we travel or not, whether we do like we're doing now, access opportunities digitally. And then we always suggest that technology and services are actually at the bottom, because they're the things that are dependent upon these wider changes in society. Here in the UK, we're very fortunate that the DFT a couple of years ago published the Future of Mobility Urban Strategy. I'd well recommend having a read of that, that describes change in terms of automation, cleaner transport, new business models, modes, data and connectivity, changing attitudes. And we've added a seventh, which is the aggregation piece, joining things together in different ways. We've also got other changes, and I'm glad that John touched on the future of transport in the rural sense. So the DFT's had their rural call for evidence here in the UK, and we're all wrestling with the opportunities of Bus Back Better, the new national bus strategy that we've got. So I talk about mobility rather than transport. We see mobility as being wheels, feet, and data. doing things digitally, rather than perhaps our old transport definitions of trains and buses and taxis and scooters and whatever else. And this is really important. So if you think about needs and access, we've all experienced this massive change over the last 20 years from where we used to use transport, which was to go to buildings largely to do things, so going to the bank or going to the shops or the cinema or the library, or to go out to have food. Now many of those goods and services can come to us. So think about Netflix, Amazon Prime, think about Audible, audiobooks, think about your banking, think about Uber Eats and having food deliveries, etc. So goods and services can now come to us in ways that were never there before, which is really interesting because it means a wider set of people can access goods and services. So transportation mobility is much wider than it ever was. So if you think about uncertainty, we are at probably the most uncertain time for certainly 100 years. We've had technological change through the rise of the internet and connectivity over the last 25 years. We've had wider technological changes, and of course, we've all experienced a global pandemic. So uncertainty is huge. But what we're advocating on this slide is a move away from planning for vehicles to planning for people and places. So this takes us on a different trajectory where we could reduce the numbers of private motor vehicles, sole occupancy cars over time to help us meet our net zero carbon goals. So this is really important. And this is massive. It's a massive change in terms of how we've thought. If we plan for people and places, that results in some very, very different potential outcomes. So let's think about people, places, and what we do. And this is really at the heart of what I wanted to talk around today. So we think about people, the young, the aging, life stages and events, gender orientation, ethnicity, social and financially excluded, the disabled. All of those people and more all have different needs from transportation. They all have different needs within their lives at the life stages that they're going through. So a young person coming out of school perhaps is very different from a person that's about to retire. The arrival of the first child significantly changes how you negotiate your life and what you do. And then thinking about the intersectionality between gender, age, orientation, ethnicity, all those things all have a perspective on how we engage and use transportation. Think about our activities, retail and leisure, healthcare, workplace and employment, education and learning, our social activities, particularly as we come out of lockdown, all underpinned by delivery and logistics that enables the food to move around, that enables the medicines to get to pharmacies, that brings the things we use in the workplace, the computers and all those sorts of things. So this interlinked set of activities, rather than just thinking about these vehicles are moving around, what are the people in those vehicles doing? Why are they doing it? And what's driving them? And also thinking about places. So our big urban areas, our big cities, our mega cities. Think about the peri-urban, the suburban bit that wraps around where perhaps there's more car dependency. People have got different behaviors. They might be at a different life stage. So the people in our urban areas tend to be younger because of universities and a more active and attractive city life. As you get a family, you might move out to the suburbs. As you get older, you might move out to the rural. But also there are people that spend all their lives in these places. And let's think about remote rural, national parks, places that are a long way from anywhere. And then think about coastal. Coastal communities have challenges that other places don't have because they have less transportation services by their very nature. So what do we want to achieve? Well, let's think about community. We want to be friendlier, greener, happier, healthier, more productive, prosperous, quieter, and safer, which are all things that mobility can help us do. How we travel, why we travel, can all contribute to those things in the decisions that we make, the technologies we introduce, the sort of interventions we develop. So within a human-centric, place-based ecosystem, we illustrate it like this. It's the energy that will drive our decarbonised transport. It's the digital services that allow us to book, pay for, use, check things. And it's mobility itself in whatever modes, going to the different types of places, serving the different activities of all those types of people. So if we want to put the human at the heart of things, how should we, or how might we do that? Well, this is work we've done in the Oxford to Cambridge arc here in the UK, where we've looked at the accessibility and density of all of the places in this part of the world, the 5 million people that live there. Pink on here is the least accessible, least dense rural places, lots and lots of pink. The dark greens at the other end of the spectrum are those city locations, those dense locations. So this immediately illustrates the challenge in that part of the world. We then use Experian Mosaic data. So this is retail-led data from credit reference agencies that's captured on all retail purchases, and it tells you the behaviors of people in different places. So we look at all this data. And what's this showing us on this slide? Green, lots of green on here. These are people described as living in the country living, rural reality. Your purples, city prosperity, municipal challenge, etc. All of these types of people have descriptions. All of these people have retail behaviors. Some of them are interested in the environment. Some of them use cash versus digital. Some of them are making all sorts of different purchases around their life stages and what they're doing. So what we do is we think about that retail environment and what it means for transportation. So we consider the needs of those people: reliability, safety, security, all the things we've traditionally spoken about. Integration between modes, multimodal travel, how important are those things at those different life stages? How important is digital connectivity to what they do and the sort of work they do? Do they have a smartphone? Have they got a bank account? So many people still don't have either of those things, yet we focus on digital all the time. And what are they doing? What's important? Is it about social interactions? Is it about education, healthcare? So we consider all those needs together. And we consider the pain points in the journeys at those life stages. So it's very different if you're an expectant young mum trying to negotiate public transport, or with a young child, than perhaps it is as a 18-year-old at the prime of your life. It's very different if you're starting to get mobility problems and healthcare issues. So we match the types of solutions to the types of needs, to the types of people in the types of places, that then give us bundles of interventions to give us a new hierarchy. And this is quite important. So we're trying to avoid traveling. We're trying to shift people onto more sustainable modes, and we're trying to improve the solutions, the infrastructure for those modes. And that leads us to this sort of new hierarchy here, where on foot and cycling, on foot and wheeled cycling at the top of the heap, but then we've got new interventions: e-cargo bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters. Then we've got more obscure things, pavement and road delivery devices. So these are the Starship robots and other sorts of things, traditional bus, ride hailing. So what we've got here is a hierarchy of more desirable uses, and then getting down to the bottom: sole occupancy car, underutilized vehicles, the vehicles that aren't being used well. So taking this people-centric approach, thinking about humans, thinking about their needs, we take this approach at the center of our work in future mobility, where we're working for all levels of government and increasingly in the private sector, who are building the cities and the towns and the villages and the places of the future, to take a different approach for our relationship with transportation and mobility. And at the heart of it is design-led thinking, where we think about the problem space, we think about the solution space, and we adopt the principles of the Design Council here in the UK of putting the human at the center of design, empathizing with their needs, defining problems, ideating around potential solutions, not using what we've done before, and then testing and iterating as we go to improve and improve and improve. So that's me. Let's change the way we think, and let's create change. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass you on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Giles, for that really thought-provoking insight, really setting a pace really about how we have to put people at the center. One quick question: you've got 60 seconds to give me a view. Many professionals in the transport planning and logistics sector may now have developed their understanding. They see themselves as placemakers rather than transporters. But do you think as a profession we need to perhaps revisit and relearn the way we think?
It's a really good question. It's something that I talk about an awful lot. I think we've possibly underestimated that relationship between the human and place and the activity. So I don't think it's not changing things seismically. It's about thinking about our planning colleagues, thinking about our transportation colleagues, thinking about our environmental colleagues. I've described it as a merging of skills, perhaps, as we enter this age of having to decarbonize, where we have to think much more multidisciplinary. And if we can all do that, I'm sure when we come out of the other side and we've hopefully solved all these problems, we might segment more and become more expertise, but more empathy to other people's professions and ways of thinking, and being open to suggestions from others, I think would be my advice.
Excellent. And Giles, we'll come back to you with some more questions in the panel discussion at the end. And just a reminder to all of our participants, please start asking those questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick those up later on. Let's go to our next speaker now. So we're delighted to have Deborah Fox with us. She's going to talk around laying the foundations for a smarter transport system based on her key role as Head of Demand Management at Transport for West Midlands. She's going to tell you a lot of exciting stuff about their Live Lab and other government funding that's been given towards the projects there. So thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much, John. So let's see if we can canter through the first couple of slides. So what I'm looking to do is translate what Giles is talking about at a strategic level, at a policy level, into a busy operational environment. And that's what we find ourselves in the West Midlands, in the United Kingdom. So on the next slide, please, John. So the West Midlands is facing an unprecedented level of growth. And this is in particular where demand management techniques can come into their own. So the West Midlands, as you can see, is in the middle of England there, sort of radiating out from Westminster and going through a sort of devolution of responsibilities and budgets. So our strategic context is what I'm going to cover just briefly first of all, and then come on and tell you a little bit about the Network Resilience Live Lab. And the Live Lab is sponsored by the Department of Transport. It's part of the ADEPT Smart Places Live Labs programme. And this is a 2-year programme, a £22 million project across England that is funded by the DFT and will run until November 2021. So let's have a look at the next slide. And here is a little bit about the strategic context in the West Midlands. And a golden thread runs through all our strategies from the industrial strategy right through to the most recent COVID-19 transport plan, which is more of our immediate operational response. But then even more recently, John, on our next slide, I just wanted to just stop for a moment on a very recent plan, which is a programme for implementing the environmental recovery. And that is linked to the West Midlands hashtag 2041 programme and our reflection on the climate emergency that happened back in June 2019. And I suppose pausing on this, I was really considering the questions of today in two contexts. One is sustainability, meaning for the long term. So how can we implement tools and strategies that will be sustainable for the long term, but also those three aspects of sustainability: the social, the environmental and the economic, and how they interplay. So if we go on to the next slide, I talked about operational responses. And so a little over a year ago in the West Midlands, we conceived of and delivered the Regional Transport Coordination Centre. Now, it does have a physical presence in Birmingham, the city in the West Midlands. However, all of us, and myself included, are considered part of the team RTCC. And we are all charged with coming up with operational solutions that can help to keep our customer or our citizen moving across the West Midlands, whatever part of the network they're travelling on. And that includes all our modes of transport, and really reflecting on Giles's point that it is about, looking at people's lives rather than the mode of transport. But I wanted to just stop on the 4 R's of travel demand management that we often quote and consider those under the lens of sustainability. Because there is a school of thought that says, well, managing demand is simply shifting traffic around the network. It doesn't actually have any sustainability benefits. But the classic, I suppose, is the remode option. And so that we're looking at more sustainable and active modes of travel, perhaps moving more towards the top of the pyramid that Giles reflected on earlier on. However, reducing or removing unnecessary vehicle trips has got to be part of the 4 R's. And certainly when we're looking at suppressing demand, for example, from a major international sporting event, or where an area is going through an unprecedented disruption on the network, as we often are in the West Midlands in terms of our regeneration programmes, albeit short term, that disruption on the network does mean we need to suppress journeys. And then finally, the retime and reroute in our 4 R's. We do consider that, you know, part of a sustainability solution, because we are avoiding pollution from idling. And I was I was reading up on this and just really sort of reflecting on the fact that anything longer than 10 seconds of idling uses more fuel and produces more polluting emissions than stopping and restarting an engine. And I don't think that really sort of permeates through into the mindset of people in sort of making their single occupancy vehicle trips or making those van journeys that perhaps could be avoided by combining a load in a van and through sort of freight consolidation and so on. But then finally, looking at that societal aspect of demand management. And sustainability. And I think there is a 5th R in play here, and that is reassurance as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and encourage people to feel a little bit more reassured about the return to public transport. And that's certainly very pertinent here in the UK. So if we move on to the next slide, please, John. What we're trying to do in West Midlands, and specifically Transport for West Midlands being the transport arm of the West Midlands Combined Authority, is really put the citizen or the customer at the forefront of everything that we do in our network resilience. And so looking at the left of the diagram there, you know, we have all of our individual modes of transport all working exceptionally hard to keep the customer moving. But then between them and the customer, we can bring all that information together in a smart way, feeding in information on incidents, for example, looking at our performance dashboards, and forming a single view of the programme. So whilst we have that large conurbation of the West Midlands and multiple points where there may be disruptions happening, we can help keep people moving through those points so that they aren't disrupted on their journeys. But of course, a significant part of that is making sure that people are aware of this and that they can hear those disruption points and actually take notice and take action. And so our communication strategies are absolutely critical here. And if we move on to the next slide, John, here we can see our communications and engagement strategy in network resilience. And fundamentally, we build in nudge tactics here. So every communication that goes out has some call to action to enable people to consider their journeys and what they can do. Very critically, one version of the truth. So when there's a large amount of disruption on the network, as an inevitability of a big regeneration program or multiple schemes happening, construction schemes, shall we say, happening on the network, then we form that single view. And if we move on to the next slide, John, we can see how that actually sort of manifests itself in the public domain. And this was a multidisciplinary travel demand management intervention on the Five Ways underpass in Birmingham. Now, an underpass, you may feel, doesn't sound like it would have such a significant impact on network travel. However, this was a major arterial route into Birmingham city centre. It has now been permanently closed to traffic, and so a substantial amount of people had to consider how they would reroute, retime or remode their journeys, or even remove them as mentioned. So let's get on to the next slide. And I really wanted to talk to you more about the Network Resilience Live Lab project. And in May 2019, we commenced this project Transport for West Midlands working hand in hand with Birmingham City Council and Solihull Council, our partners, alongside 8 other suppliers and partners in the project. And really, you know, we're looking at you know, a number of different operational aspects in this. But we're part of a network of 9 local authorities and their partners working across 8 innovative projects in the Adept Smart Places programme. So not only are we learning ourselves, but we're also learning from their activities and their the benefits of their programmes as well. So fundamentally what we're trying to do here is get a real-time view of the network. And we're trying to learn how to do this ourselves in Transport for West Midlands, because we want that sustainability, we want that long-term ability to really work with our customers and citizens in the West Midlands, and not just to end the project as it would at the end of November by switching off sources of data that we would otherwise have to access through expensive contracts. So what we're trying to do is combine data analytics from multiple sources, including a camera-based monitoring system, but also INRIX data and mobile phone data, and get a really deep understanding of customers who use the road network. So there are millions of feeds and records coming in daily. And so what are we doing with them? Well, they're already having operational solutions. So there is a COVID-19 dashboard that combines all of the feeds from our different modes and from the static automatic counters we have out on the network as a result of the Live Labs project. And that's been really useful, as within the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a flattening out of the peaks across the road network, but certainly not an absence of traffic in the West Midlands, where there is a high car dependency. So we're also learning through a project called Serrano with Birmingham City University on how we use artificial intelligence vision systems and understand vehicles and really develop our products around that. So if we move on to the next slide. We formed a close collaboration with West Midlands Police, and the key reason for this was that rather than deploying new camera technology ourselves and finding that sort of maintenance burden of additional fixed assets, we wanted to work with the West Midlands Police that already have a very advanced system of consultation with communities, and so they've helped us to work with communities to make sure that we can use the data coming from those static automatic traffic counters, but the communities feel comfortable with this, because often the deployment of cameras can make people feel understandably nervous. So we formed a memorandum of understanding with West Midlands Police, and this has been a huge step forward for us, and also for them, because we're using the whole data set and not only the data that is used for crime reduction purposes or crime and incident purposes. And from this, we can really start to build up a picture of what's happening out on the network, a near real-time view. And if we move on to the next slide, please, John. Then combining that now with personas, traveller personas, and Giles mentioned the segmentation that can be done with companies such as Experian, and we've certainly already been working with that and companies such as Experian in the West Midlands. But we've taken that a stage further. So looking at the heart of the segments in the West Midlands, we've worked with 44 people in a very in-depth, granular way over winter, and to understand the real kind of insights into those people's lives. And not surprisingly, their lives aren't all focused around travel. There are so many things going on in people's lives other than travel and transport. And this is quite a good learning for us in the transport sector, that people's lives aren't focused just around our shiny transport product. So we've distilled 14 traveller personas. And as we're coming into the final few months of the Live Lab, we're looking at trialling, working with people that epitomise these personas in the field in 2 live trials, and working alongside a provider who is going to be capturing the learning from that, and also distilling operational methods of really tracking and sort of measuring, if you like, the removal of vehicles from our network or how they move around. So I'm really excited about this last stage of the project. And if anybody listening today has any insights into how to combine the technologies that we're using with personas, and they've done that in the field, we'd really love to hear from you. But moving on to the next slide, please, John. I just wanted to start to come to a close. And I just mentioned, I think, John, you did introduce me as the new interim chair of the CILT TDM forum in the UK. But I'm really, really proud to be leading this forum. And if anyone in the event today or listening afterwards is part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport in the UK, we'd very much like to have you on board in our forum if you're interested in travel demand management. And as we head into this new forum, we really want to incorporate all the different perspectives. And one that John brings himself is that community perspective. So it's not only the perspectives of the private and the public sectors, but I think really also considering how technology and digital solutions can help us to help the customer or the citizen to navigate our places, whether they're stations, the road network, the tram system, and so on, all those places in between in intermodal journeys. And then going back to the 4 Rs to remote, reroute, retime, and remove journeys, very much core to our discipline. So if anyone listening to this presentation is interested in joining our forum, we'd very much like to have you, and we look forward to seeing you there. But really, that's all from me. Just want to finish off with a few links that people may find useful. We do have at our Live Lab web page, we do have video available there. We have a newsletter and also just a bit of a broader description of the project as we head into our final year to November 2021. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Deborah, for that insight. Just while Becky gets herself ready to present, a couple of things really struck me here. Number one, you know, the Travel Demand Management Forum, it's been something, I guess, that the UK has been crying out for in terms of bringing together this wide family of people that impacts on the way we move and looking at it with a slightly different lens in terms of the human-centric approach. Certainly, I think that there's an encouraging message there for all of our CILT viewers across the world that actually, if that's an agenda that matters to you as well, you know, TDM forums can pop up, you know, in lots of other places as well. And hopefully you've seen already that it's not limited to a kind of UK or even European market. It's a much wider application. So just while Becky's getting ready, one very quick question. How does the Live Lab approach work for all customer types? So I'm going to be a bit challenging. What about passenger and freight? So is there a delivery driver persona that's been tested, or should there be?
Yeah, that's very interesting, John. So as I mentioned, we started off with the picking out the core characteristics of each of the main segments in the West Midlands. And so we've sought to find individuals that represent that and develop personas with them. So there were 44 individuals involved in that in a very ethnographic approach, and we developed 14 personas from that. So each of those personas has they have their lived experience includes their employment. And so there isn't a persona that is the freight driver, but there may be, several people that have family members that are involved in freight, for example, or they're involved in the the vehicle industry in some way. And as you'll be aware, in the West Midlands, we have a very, very strong vehicle manufacturing tradition and some very large companies, for example, Jaguar Land Rover, based within our administrative boundaries. So yes, it's inevitable that some of those personas do have touch points with the freight industry. But I'll go back to the fact that, you know, we've developed the personas from really the sort of the core of our segments in the West Midlands, and based on things like postcode data and so on. And so we've built the personas around people's lives rather than seeking a type, if you like, or a profession. Yeah. So that's how we've approached it.
Excellent. And that's a bit of a change, because we're actually looking at understanding lifestyles and choice rather
Yes.
than modes and specific behavior at a specific time, which is obviously a big limitation if you only monitor in that way. Thanks, Deborah. Delighted to hear from you. Becky. Becky is third up, and she's going to be covering a bit more of a strategic view. We've looked at the human aspects. We're now looking at effective policy frameworks and how they can help to deliver transport decarbonisation. So she's going to pick up on some of her research across over 16 countries around the world and how important it is to have that strategic framework in place. Over to you, Becky.
Okay, thank you, John. Let me try to share my slides. So first of all, I really want to thank Mr. John Harris for inviting me to speak and to share with you today. Because as a former international vice president of the Institute and having known John for many years, I would really love to support this series of global online webinars. As today's topic is smart and sustainable mobility, delivering low carbon places, I would like to share with you my thoughts on the importance of a strategic framework if we are to really progress towards smart and sustainable mobility in low carbon society. I believe sitting around here, we all understand the urgent need to reduce transport carbon emissions. So worldwide, it is still growing, and transport is now the second largest source of CO2 emissions by sector. And this also explains why decarbonizing the transport sector has become central in climate change mitigation efforts. Yet, let us ask, are we aiming at low carbon or low mobility as the ultimate primary goal? Now, the two are not the same. For our discussion today, the targets may be low carbon, sustainability, and being smart, but it is not having transport and logistics activities at all or against mobility. So transport and logistics activities are not undesirable per se. Instead, increased levels of mobility are one of the main driving forces of economic growth. In some American and Australian cities, people are already studying about excessive or wasteful mobility, that people are moving much farther away than necessary because of the convenience of driving. But nonetheless, in many developing countries, the increase in mobility is actually very important to the economic growth, for example, industrialization, and the overall well-being of their population with access to school, and different types of facilities. Now, yet transport has given rise to a multitude of negative environmental impacts, including carbon emissions and local air pollution. Now, these impacts are seen as negative externalities because they are neither carefully considered nor compensated for in transport investment decisions. So as a result, we see the coupling of economic growth and transport carbon. Now, however, if we can address the link by reducing the negative transport externalities associated with a level of transport activities, we would be able to decouple the two. Now, this is very important because decoupling would allow countries to promote economic development, but at the same time suppress transport-related carbon emissions. Now, with this conceptual framework, how can we achieve transport decarbonization? Now, firstly, we can obviously just reduce mobility. Now, either voluntarily, like we are having a lot of behavioral change programs, or by regulations like the COVID lockdown or work from home arrangements. Now, if we keep the coupling, the only way to achieve transport decarbonization is reducing mobility. However, with decoupling, there are more ways. We can maintain mobility, but achieve transport decarbonization by reducing the per passenger and freight kilometers of carbon consumption and emissions. Now, theoretically, we may even have a higher level of mobility by drastically reducing the carbon intensity of the existing transport system. And we are looking at this at a global level. Now, here you can see, if we want to achieve the low carbon goal, this is actually very complex and there is no simple solution. So transport decoupling is multidimensional and is multi-scale. In one of my previous papers, we look at the 5 transformations from a city's urban form to its economy, to the vehicles, to the modal fleet that Deborah also mentioned a lot, to our lifestyle that Giles has also mentioned. It actually requires changes all the way from national, regional, neighborhood to individual levels. So hence, that's why a strategic framework is necessary. Now, this is a 9-component strategic framework with a dual emphasis on policy planning as well as policy implementation. Now, for any complex urban challenges, there is always the policy implementation gap. Now, for instance, if we have a lot of emphasis on the vision, objectives, and targets, but we don't have sufficient actual funding, the institutional setup, and the monitoring of it, the transport intensity may actually increase. So a strategy is actually necessary to bind all these components together so that the chance of achieving the overall primary goal will be high. Now, so here we look at 16 nations across 6 major continents. Now, these countries are significant because they accounted for 75% of the world's GDP and 60% of the total carbon emissions. We then identified periods that these countries have done well in transport decarbonization from 1990 to 2018. And we systematically examined their transport decarbonization strategies and policies during those periods with improvements according to the 9 components. Now here, generally, you can see that from 1990 to 2004, the inner circle, there were a few successful transport decarbonization attempts, such as the fuel economy labeling, and they were mainly introduced in the developed nations. Now, in the more recent periods, there were many more diversified measures. Now, in this final slide, you will see that the critical factors of transport decarbonization at different spatial scales. And here I want to highlight a few points. Now, firstly, there is a need for the strategic framework, especially like for countries like the UK being big, to carry through the national to the regional and the local level. So just relying on the local and bottom-up approach will not do. Secondly, it's actually important to consider the non-transport dimension in this strategic framework, such as compact city development and controlling urban sprawl. Thirdly, there is a need to set quantifiable targets in carbon reduction, specifically for the transport sector. Now, R&D in developing smart mobility that supports public transport is very important. So next, at the regional level, it is important to effectively monitor the emission standards of transport operators and fuel manufacturers. and to foster public-private research partnerships to increase the uptake of low carbon technology in the market, just like, in West Midlands. And finally, at the local level, it's very important to ensure that local communities have a sense of ownership of the national objectives as well, so that they feel that they have a part to play. And the provision of supporting infrastructure at the local level is also critical. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I want to close this by acknowledging my PhD graduate, Dr. Choi Ga-ho, as the materials presented here came from our joint publication that he has played a very important role as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Becky, for that different viewpoint, bringing home really the importance of the policy framework. Just while we get ready to hear from Lucy, one question for you. You talked about national down to local. With globalization and transport working more internationally across borders, how do you think regions or clusters of countries should tackle the carbon agenda? So, for example, CILT is active within the Gulf states around UAE, Oman. We're active in Central Asia. What happens if they don't have the same carbon zero priorities around transport? How could this model help with solving that?
Right. So I think this is getting very real. The important thing, a lot of these like CILT International can do is to foster the goodwill of a dialogue. And this is very important, right? Because in a lot of the international atmosphere, especially if we're having hostile international atmosphere, this will only make things worse, like finger pointing, this country is not doing this, and then criticizing each other for inaction, like this country is not prioritizing or setting up a carbon neutral objective. So I mean, at the international level, especially with the big family of CILT family, being able to collaborate and to allow each of the individual branches and countries to understand each other's strengths and limitations of transport decarbonization, I think is a very important first step. And this similar logic can also apply within a country at different scales, right? With different regions. Sometimes, like even when we are looking at the UK, different regions may have different priorities as well. So it's really important that we have the dialogue and looking at this at different scales, from nation, regions, to the cities and the borough. I mean, dialogues like what you are having now in the UK can be very good international examples as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Becky. And
thank you, John.
You're welcome. If anyone's got any questions, we're already getting some in the chat, which we will have time to cover. Can I just remind everyone, 15 minutes time we'll be opening up the panel, so get your questions in. We're going to hear from Lucy Anderton now, and we've asked her to talk about sustainable mobility from a rail perspective. Although her main training was here in the UK, her work is now global, looking at the role of railways and their role in society in terms of green recovery. So very much a global perspective. Let's hear from Lucy.
Well, thank you so much for having me here on your webinar. I'm really excited here to be sharing my thoughts from the global perspective of the railway community. I want to talk to you about rail really is what is the backbone of a future sustainable mobility system. So really see the role of railways as having that kind of spinal, central way of coordinating a whole mobility system, working with lots of other modes to really support a just and a green recovery and transition to sustainable cities, sustainable lifestyles and sustainable economies, and really see rail as having an important role in doing that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, particularly, of course, in the role of recovery from our current situation. But first I want to introduce you to the UIC, which for those of you who have not heard of us before, we're the International Union of Railways and have been in existence for 100 years now. We're celebrating our centenary next year and formed really to bring about international cooperation in the railway community after the Second World War. So it's really been there ever since, just to really bring the railway communities together in harmonisation, in cooperation, knowledge sharing and interoperability. And today we have over 200 members in 95 countries, which represents quite a lot of railway actually. We're talking about 3,000 billion passenger kilometres every year and 10,000 billion tonne kilometres for freight. I mean, it's really quite mind-boggling actually when you think about that kind of global reach and how we can bring that community together. So we work on really in that bringing people together, convening. So we have an awful lot of working groups, congresses, conferences and workshops. But we're also very much a technical organisation. And so we have a large library of international railway solutions. And so they're essentially technical standards that really support that harmonisation and interoperability. And we work with lots of other institutions and professional bodies as well. But as part of the UIC, we've got a sustainability platform. And so that's where we really convene the sustainability professionals and those that are really interested in developing sustainability performance across railways. And we convene over 5 main topic areas that are really seen as the priority topics for our members. And those are air quality, energy efficiency and carbon dioxide emissions, circular economy or resource efficiency debates, noise and vibration, and sustainable land use, which includes both vegetation management and also biodiversity and how the railways can help the loss and support the reverse of the loss of biodiversity globally. And we're aligned, of course, to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. And we're really there to try to set a vision, and we do a lot of work in advocacy, working with the United Nations and other global organisations, but also provide tools. So we have data analysis tools and ways to calculate, say, the carbon emissions from a passenger journey or a freight journey as well. So we have all sorts of tools available for our members. But the most important actually is just to convene our community and to really help empower that community to be that driving force in a green recovery through collaborative knowledge and advocacy. So yeah, we talked about that vision, and this is the kind of vision that we use, that really we want a railway that supports a green recovery as part of as the backbone of a sustainable mobility. So we're talking about connectivity that contributes to a healthy, sustainable lifestyles and economies on every continent. And that's all about zero emissions. It's about the railways being a part of a community hub and being part of the cities and the communities they serve. Being accessible for all, so making railways available for more and more people, connecting more and more people, and both being a biodiverse green corridor and actually being a good neighbour as well, and the responsibility of living and operating next to a railway. But of course it's been a very difficult year for railways. You can see here on some of the graphs, the ridership and of course the revenue with it has gone off a cliff face last year. And we've been working with all our members to help them through this difficult time. And we've had what we call a COVID-19 task force, where around 100 of our members came together to share how they were coping with it, share different techniques and approaches to really help each other through this difficult year. And it's been really interesting discussions because we've also been sharing data around that, and that's where you can see some of this information that our members have been sharing with us. You can see just how that massive drop-off of ridership right across lots of cities and countries here. But then you can see, of course, over the course of the year, that ridership starting to come back again. But for road, we've seen that road is pretty much back at pre-pandemic levels, but for rail and other forms of public transport like metro and buses are still quite significantly below where we should be, where we were before the pandemic. Except, of course, that if you see on that bottom right, that's Shanghai. You can see they're starting quite a significant improvement now, and are looking to have a public transport ridership above where they were before. So that's really exciting and encouraging. But globally, you'll see, of course, that ridership remains low and quite unsure at the moment. So this is a problem, isn't it? It's a problem for our for the crisis that's just on the horizon, because the United Nations are very much launching in COP26 this year in Glasgow that this is the decade of action. How we start and end this decade will set us on track to meet the Paris Accord, to keep climate change below 2 degrees, and really it's a bit of an important decade that we must take action now to really get us out on the right track. So it's quite urgent. It's really urgent. It's really critical. And we really see railways as having a massive role in being able to support that, because actually transport emissions have been going up. One of the only sectors that have continued going up and have not really slowed down. Mobility and connectivity has really been still a rising demand. People want to travel, people want to connect. So how do we reverse and slow down this trend? Everybody understands that we need to phase out internal combustion engines and the use of fossil fuels. And actually railways is largely already done that. Not 100%, of course, but largely already an electric mobility solution for many. So we're a mode there that's ready to really take that capacity. And so the quickest way to deal with this, and the quickest way to really take action in this decade, is to have this significant shift to rail, modal shift, so that railway is taking a much bigger share in the transport mobility. And we can see that it's really compelling, the case for rail. This is some of the infographics that are taken off our the Rail Freight Forward white paper. And we can see just how compelling and environmentally better rail is to most other modes. So it's really an obvious choice, isn't it, to make that modal shift? Because yeah, this is while we're focusing on a very urgent short-term issue at the moment, there's some really big waves coming. And so what are we doing to really make sure that transport and our societies, our cities are really resilient to a change that's coming? What we've seen actually is a real acceleration of some significant trends as well, haven't we, in the last year? So we've seen a huge acceleration of more people home working, of course, and I think many people would consider it likely that that's here to stay. But what's the opportunity for transport? It actually could be great for smoothing those peaks that we have problems with in the morning and evenings. And really it can accelerate the way that we can modernise the way that we do ticketing and season passes and things like that. There's also an awful lot of public spending happening as well. So what can we really do to make the most out of those stimulus packages that are coming through for public financing to really accelerate the improvements in our infrastructure and our rolling stock? Also, I think this last year has really accelerated an interest and a passion in sustainable choices, and more consumers are really thinking about the sustainability of the products that they're buying and their own responsibility to reduce carbon footprint. So I think this gives us a real opportunity to really promote the sustainability of rail and to really build on the momentum to decarbonise rail and public transport overall, and to really remain competitive with other modes on that. I think market liberalisation is becoming much more global as well. And so what is there about the competition that can really help us as an opportunity to really improve rail's offering, to really bring about new routes and new improved customer offerings? So I think sort of maybe our objectives should be, or in terms of capitalising these opportunities, is to really, what can we do to enhance our customer experience right now? Because we need this modal shift, the world needs this modal shift, but as railway operators, as transport people, we've got to work really, really hard, I think, to enhance our customer experience. So what can we do to really adapt to these new mobility behaviours and these new markets? Perhaps there's something we can really do to take advantage of green tourism and people perhaps using rail and public transport for recreation in a different way. Also look at, of course, the economic equation. How can we really be efficient and really demonstrate that we bring value to society? How can we be clever at really making clear the value that we bring in connecting people and moving logistics around the country and internationally? And also, how can we really improve our environmental performance as well, so we stay competitive and really remain the leader as public transport people, as offering the most environmentally friendly point of transport. And I think we've got to innovate. We've got to really bring about that culture of continually improving and adapting to these new technologies. I think we've got to invest in our public transport infrastructure and really ensure a really high quality service for our customers. And that's mostly about interoperability, multimodality, and really working together as a transport system and working with other modes and operators to do that. And so there's this idea of co-opetition. So we've all got our strengths. So where does it make most sense to have certain modes? Let's make sure we're linked together for the best for our customers and the best environmental option for those journeys. So yeah, I think that's I would just conclude saying that, you know, there's a real challenge for us now as we look to recover from the pandemic. And I think those cities that are really investing in public transport now will come out stronger and will come out better cities for people to live in, and more exciting and enjoyable, because it, of course, public transport not only addresses our climate change issues, but it will reduce those congestion problems, those local air quality, and injuries through accidents as well. So there's really lots of benefits from investing now. So yeah, that's my sort of final thoughts. And there's the details, of course, to get in touch with UIC. I hope that was interesting, John.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Lucy, for that global perspective, bringing sustainability, rail, the current carbon crisis all together in a very clear set of messages. Particularly liked all the evidence that you've brought together there. I'm sure many of our listeners right across the world, they will have rail systems serving key cities. This will really resonate with many of our CILT family. So thank you for joining us today. We've just got a couple of questions, if you don't mind, Lucy. I just want to talk to you about. You referred to this kind of window of opportunity for rail.
Yeah.
But you also talked about urgency and criticality. Those words came across strongly. So do you think globally we are accelerating enough on this move to sustainable rail, or is there a bit more oomph factor that we've got to build in?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, actually. And I'm always really optimistic that we will be able to accelerate. But at the moment, I think so many people are sort of waiting to see what's going to happen. And but those cities and those countries that are really getting ready to thrive rather than just trying to survive are going to be the real success stories from this. So I think it's really varied, and I think over the past few years, things have stagnated. There hasn't been that move, that modal shift that everyone keeps talking about. Everyone keeps recognising we need to use public transport more, but still we haven't seen that. Still we're seeing a similar kind of modal share numbers. So I think we really need this decade ahead to really rocket that up and really start seeing like twice as many people taking public transport or using rail freight.
So let's just pick up on that. My last question is to do with that kind of golden mode share that we're all questing for, I think, as transport and logistics professionals. We've seen some radical changes in travel behaviour over the last year. You've shown that on the graphs earlier with the precipice. So what's interesting is that through the COVID crisis, far more mode share or mode change has ever happened than if we went through a voluntary or carrot type initiative. For example, with the London 2012 Olympic Games, that was one of the first strategic travel behaviour change. That took 2 years of planning to achieve a 30% drop in use of the London Underground network to enable people to move around during the games. Think of the effort there, and yet overnight we saw this, 10% of previous levels. In order to maintain a healthy mode share, what do you think really needs to happen in terms of intervention? We've tried volunteering, we've tried the logic we build and passengers will come. What do you think really needs to happen to make that step change?
Yeah. Well, I think there's something on both sides, isn't there? So I think as sort of logistics operators and professionals in working in the industry, it's like, how do we really make our product brilliant, so that it's the most comfortable, it's the easiest, it's the most economical choice, so that it's just the obvious choice. So it's about that kind of real customer focus, I think, and that's mostly to do with that interoperability, multimodality that we've got to get to, because at the moment one of the real downsides that people see it is that we either in freight or passengers are not quite connected. The timetables don't quite synchronize, or there's just not an obvious way to get from door to door. So I think if we solve that door-to-door problem, that will make a massive difference, and it's got to be through cooperation with all other modes. But then there's a public policy point of view as well, isn't there? Because we need a level playing ground. We need a level playing ground for when we're talking about policy, fiscal policy, and things like that, so that it's not more technical. You don't have to fill out more forms to transport your goods by rail. Why? It's so easy to transport things by truck across Europe at the moment. Unfortunately, you've got 20 times as many pieces of paper to fill in to take it by rail, and it's just not right. And how do we make sure that it's just as easy and really well priced?
Thanks, Lucy. So a final 30 seconds. You've kind of talked about this levelling up and around rail being almost a staple diet for countries across the world. From what you've just said, does your approach still hold true for developing countries or countries historically where investment in rail over the last 10, 20 years has been poor? What would you say to that final challenge?
Yeah. Well, I think what we're doing at UIC is trying to connect those in developing countries with the developed, try and leapfrog some of those difficulties that we've had, and to really share knowledge across the region. So I think that's one thing that can be really supportive in this kind of global community that we've got, and that both CILT and UIC really foster. But then, but the principles stay the same, what can we do to really make this a great service offering, and what can the governments do to really support that level playing ground? And the solutions will be slightly different, but I think the theory is the same.
Great, so plenty of food for thought there. Thank you so much, Lucy. And remember, if any of you are interested, check out the UIC website. Thank you once again, Lucy.
Pleasure. Thank you, John.
Excellent. So we're straight into questions, everybody. And I'm just going to pick a couple that have come in. Edward Lau has put a couple up. I'm going to ask this question first to Deborah, actually. Edward's question is about TDM approach and customer-centric mobility. He's asking the key question is what has to happen with the local and national level town planning policies and frameworks in order for that to work? Deborah, and then I'll bring Giles and Becky in.
Thanks, John. And I think this is a really interesting question, and it's certainly not something that I feel that we're doing adequately, certainly in England right now. I mean, my view is that we need to be really considering, especially with large developments, what the travel plans will be for those large developments, what influence we can have really early on in the planning process on the background traffic. So that's the existing traffic that's moving in the area. Can we suppress some of that demand, or can we remode it? Also, barriers like severance, not creating developments in places which are, either severed from residential communities, or where there's really clear severance in terms of, say, cycle networks, walking networks, and so on. So then, which force the use of vehicles and single occupancy trips and so on. And also, I think the role of town planning in connecting active travel infrastructure. And the example I'm really thinking of at the moment is in Coventry in the West Midlands, where we have a proposal for an electric car battery plant on the old Coventry airport site. And this would create 4,000 new jobs. And it's absolutely critical that we look at this project at the pre-planning stage and really start to mobilise ourselves and look at it in the round. And I think the final thing I would mention was to look across our administrative boundaries across, in the UK we call them local authorities, but within municipalities. So with the Coventry Gigafactory example that I've mentioned, this spans both the West Midlands conurbation and within that, individual local authorities such as Coventry, but then it also covers communities in Warwickshire. And so those trips aren't going to stop at the administrative boundaries. So we need to find ways to have a kind of consistency of approach around demand management to help facilitate those journeys that could originate in either one of those administrations.
Excellent. Becky, have you got anything to add from that, from your wider global perspective?
Thank you, John. I think I just want to add, somehow when we are trying to look at all these and to achieve through town planning initiative and so on, is to really put this concept of seamless intermodal integration, the integration, especially the connection between the rails and the buses and also the cycle and the pedestrians, to see how exactly people are going to navigate through different transport modes to ensure that people taking railways, etc., would have a lovely travel experience. So a lot of this is really in the details of the integration, so as to ensure that a sustainable modal split can happen.
Yeah, so a lot of that's in the detail, isn't it, Becky? Giles, what's your take on that? I know WSP, obviously multidisciplinary, they are also involved very much in urban planning and development projects. What's your take on that? Oh,
I've failed. I was on mute. It's the integration between land use planning and transportation planning, I think, is becoming increasingly more important. I think we mustn't forget that we need to also be integrating, as I put on one of my slides, with our energy planners and our digital planners, etc. So thinking about the foundational things upon which we stack everything. So a much more holistic approach as to how we plan for place, putting the human at the center of it, as you expect me to say, but thinking about the energy, thinking about the digital, thinking about the land use, thinking about the urban design, and taking a much richer place, coming back to what Becky says, lovely trips for people and lovely places to live, work, play and learn as well.
Okay, and Giles, staying with you, Vicky Coos asked a good question, which is around, sometimes we kind of put the electric vehicle kind of brigade into sustainable transport, but of course there's arguments about this. It's still a box moving around on the road network. There's fossil fuel, there's battery disposal, there's whole life. What's your take on that, Giles, in terms of the EV thing? It's not as simple as good or bad, is it?
No, electric vehicles, and I say this as an electric vehicle driver, owner myself, are good in transitioning from fossil fuels. As I said, we need to reduce our overall vehicle kilometers traveled. We need to use our vehicles more efficiently. I'm a strong advocate of we need to have smaller vehicles, more fit for what we actually need to do, which has less impact. And we must remember electric vehicles are in their relative immaturity. We're about 10 years into the commercial side of it, and the real commercial uptick has only happened in the last few years. Solutions are getting better. Second life for things like batteries, etc., is becoming more important. So the cross-sectoral use of batteries, so taking a vehicle battery and then using it in homes afterwards, is a market that's developing. And yes, we need to reduce our impact on Earth's scarce resources. So it requires a collective approach, but we mustn't forget that we aren't in the end state at the moment as to what electric vehicles will become. And we mustn't forget there's a much bigger piece which is around electrified public transportation, freight, et cetera, and how we balance that with the edgy use cases in rail. So what's the role of hydrogen, etc. So it is based on use cases and needs in different places. There is no silver bullet that solves everything. It will be a blend.
Excellent. We've had some really good observations in from our viewers today. On the rail side, what I'm going to suggest is I'm actually going to reach out and get some answers on that from Lucy, of course, who was recorded for today. Pauline Suan has come through with a question, and actually it was one of my final closing comments. That there's been a lot of debate around active travel, walking, cycling, and the impact of COVID on mobility. A lot more home working, a lot more people staying online in the way they operate. Now, do you think, going back to Giles's curve, that will contribute positively towards more sustainable city planning and there be a lasting impact? Or do you think people will just try and recover to normal and we will still see the car kind of rearing its head that we will then have to suppress yet again?
I'll give you an initial view, John, since you referred to my diagram. As data in the UK came out this week that showed that actually, I think it was 2/3 of people were working at site during the pandemic because they had to. So yes, a lot of people work from home, and we as transport planners who tend to be in industries that use computers and can do things like this, we must be very careful of assuming that applies to everybody else. We still have to manufacture food. We still have to produce our vaccines and all those other things that keep society running. I think where it gets interesting is the flattening of the peaks, the change in what we do with the spare time. So perhaps more people taking more kids to school in the car, perhaps, because they're not having to commute. So I think we see a redistribution of trips that will be very challenging for us as planners, because we will see things perhaps that we've not, going back to Deborah's work, behaviorally seen before. So we're going to have to be very agile to those changes.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on that, I had some experience working in the West Midlands and in Birmingham about 4 or 5 years ago on looking at their freight strategy, looking at this stretching of the shoulders of the day, looking at using that 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and your sort of evening time. but actually trying to get people to think of it differently was quite hard. And yet along came the pandemic, and all of a sudden things started to distort and change. Deborah, from the 5 Ways experiment, do you think Birmingham have cracked it, or do you think there's more to go? And is that why Live Labs is so critical?
I think we have a long way to go, John, and I feel perhaps the pandemic has made people individually and collectively in communities more aware of the impact of individual or sole occupancy vehicle travel and the impact on the network. Congestion is a really interesting phenomenon, and I think you know, if we see a return, an en masse return to use of private vehicles for short trips, people will soon realise that the congestion that creates will actually hinder their journey going forward. So they may have found more efficient journeys, be that walking locally, you know, those sort of intermodal journeys between types of transport. You know, everyone has learned new patterns, and I think there's a University College London predicts that it takes about 66 days for behaviour to become embedded. So during the pandemic, whatever new behaviours people have been experiencing, whether that is working from home or whether it's using a private vehicle to get to their workplaces, those new behaviours have become embedded. So we almost have to unlearn those as well. So I think that the one thing that has fundamentally changed for us in Transport for West Midlands is that near real-time view of the network. So we'll be able to observe incidents and accidents and to respond to them quickly, and to communicate with people how they can take account of that in their journeys. So whether or not people go back to their mode of choice, back to their time of choice, back to their route of choice, we'll be there and able to support them in their journeys and find solutions if they're impeded in any way on making those journeys.
Great, thanks, Deborah. We're nearly out of time, but I'm going to give you all 15 seconds each to answer this question. If there's one thing that you wish as a professional we could do better in this smart city area, what would it be, Becky?
If it is this one thing, I think the most important thing is to open up people's eyes to see and to experience. Just like the COVID, you know, before the COVID, no one would thought that work from home could be, you know, really that not so horrible, so to speak. Once you experience this, you are willing to accept it. So being able to experience and to see new things across the world would be, I think, what as professionals we can do better.
Fantastic. Thank you, Becky. Deborah?
Oh gosh, that's such a big question, John. I'm just trying to think of one single answer. I think, I mean, for me, perhaps if we take the sort of professional audience, I think that multidisciplinary and multimodal working together is absolutely critical. You know, a lot of this work isn't that visible to the travelling public, but it is so important that we work multimodally in order to support people's intermodal lives.
Excellent. Thank you, Deborah. And Giles, the last say. You're on mute, Giles.
Do I win a special prize for doing that twice, John? Collaborate, and importantly, speak to people outside of transportation. Seek the views of other sectors, other opinions, creators, designers, historians, geographers, artists, all those other people. Yeah,
that's really interesting, Giles, because just from my own personal perspective, that's the one thing that the Community Rail Partnership that I work with is doing. That's our reason. We have an integrated transport stream, we have a development stream working with developers, we have an arts scheme, we have an inclusion stream. So we're trying to bring that real community, because it's at that hyper local level that people actually make their choices about their modes of travel and what is best for them. So it's really down to that grassroots lifestyle choice agenda and how the framework supports that person or doesn't, as the case may be. Well, we're just out of time, but what I am going to do is I am just going to share my screen, because there's a couple of things that I would like to be able to explain. Just to say that if you watch out for a broadcast, will come onto our YouTube channel. This is with Paul LeBlond, and Paul LeBlond is a member of the CILT UK Policy Committee and a key author linked to the Carbon Zero report produced by CILT UK. Their review report at the end of 2020 detailed in quite some measure recommendations and ideas around the net zero agenda to 2050. There will be on YouTube a half-hour interview where I'm in conversation with him. That will come out in the next couple of weeks. Also, please go and have a look on the UK website at that particular document, as it gives a really good example of a CILT organisation having a voice in this space. And if you want to find out more about that approach and are interested in how you can formulate that kind of policy response, do get in touch. So all that remains me is to say a very, very big thank you to our speakers, to Lucy, who gave up time ahead of today, Becky, Deborah and Giles. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you today, and we look forward to seeing you all again on our next CILT sustainability webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.